Have you ever encountered a trauma? And if you have, what can you do about it? This video will share with you some strategies by which you can pursue post-traumatic growth. My name is Stuart Tan. If this is the first time you're on my channel, welcome, and I'd like you to subscribe so that you can keep notified on all my future videos. Post-traumatic growth is a very interesting concept because on one hand, it seems to imply that people who have stress or post-traumatic stress disorder might not be able to recover because somehow they're more stubborn than other people. Well, that's absolutely not true. Some people do encounter post-traumatic growth, but it is not a default mechanism. A lot of the time, people think of this as resilience, but actually that's confounded. You're not thinking of somebody who can immediately bounce back from stress, but instead somebody who requires a passage of time, sort of like a hero's journey. What do I mean by this? Let's take a look at some of the markers of post-traumatic stress disorder and what it actually means. A quote from healthline.com says that a traumatic event is an incident that causes physical, emotional, spiritual, or psychological harm. The person experiencing the distressing event may feel threatened, anxious, or frightened as a result. In some cases, they may not even know how to respond, or may be in denial about the effect such an event has had. A quote from the APA, or American Psychological Association, says that a trauma is any disturbing event that results in significant fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, or other disruptive feelings intense enough to have a long-lasting negative effect on a person's attitudes, behavior, and other aspects of functioning. Traumatic events include those caused by human behavior, example, rape, war, industrial accidents, as well as by nature, example, earthquakes, and often challenge an individual's view of the world as a just, safe, and predictable place. It is true that certain things could actually create distress in people, to a point where it might resemble PTSD, even though the exact medical diagnosis does not match. One of my clients encountered a distressing event in the form of a dream. You might not actually have had a nightmare that is so powerful that it stops you from doing things that normal people would do. And this was exactly what happened to this client of mine. I've also had somebody who's made an interpretation about changes in the stock market that caused him a lot of distress. That is an interpretation of an external environment that caused some ruminations and feelings of helplessness. We could say that you don't need to have PTSD in order to have stressors. And whenever you have stressors, there are opportunities for growth. Rather than trying to normalize the emotion, I'd like to suggest a slightly different route. Firstly, I'd like you to recognize that there is a place for distressing or negative emotions inside of you. After all, if you're experiencing some kind of pain, pain is nothing more than a signal to the body to pay attention. I personally believe that any kind of psychological, emotional, or even spiritual pain is there to guide you and to give you information that you may not have been aware of previously. For example, if you've encountered a near-death experience, there must be some kind of heart palpitation that tells you that you nearly died. Now, rather than brush that aside, it is possible that your body needs some time to recognize this condition and to also get a sense of grounding so that it knows that it is in a safe place now. If you brush it aside and the body has not reconciled this feeling, it is likely to bring it back in the form of a nightmare or some other kind of unsavory behavior. The human unconscious mind is very powerful in monitoring and maintaining safety of the individual. Having said that, if you've truly experienced PTSD diagnosed by a psychiatrist, some of this information is meant for educational purposes, and while you might want to experiment on your own, it is definitely advisable that you seek some kind of professional help. If you happen to be an individual who's experiencing some difficulty, I'm willing to offer a little bit of support to get you grounded, and perhaps if you're not in a PTSD environment which might require long-term care, you could actually opt for some forms of coaching. So if you belong in this category, please fill in the form in the link down in the description below. During the phase of absolute turmoil in your emotions, and the reason why I know this is because I've encountered similar situations in my life. After all, being a psychologist doesn't mean I'm free from trauma. There have been different instances in my life that have created trauma, and unfortunately, upon my reflection, many of these things were caused by my lack or neglect of paying attention to myself. As I started to pay closer attention, I discovered that certain kinds of ritualistic activities do help to ground oneself in a way that enables the processing of these feelings more effectively rather than just opting for direct interventions. A direct intervention is where a psychologist works with you in order to help you to cognitively reframe your experiences. While that can be very powerful and very helpful and maybe even life-transforming, it is not always the best starting point all the time. You will know it yourself. The moment somebody suggests that you can do something about your feeling and you feel that that's a very sore spot, then perhaps you're not yet ready for coaching or therapy. What can you do about it in the meanwhile? There is this tendency for people to shrink and to withdraw. And while that is not always good for the long term, it might be necessary as an initial protective mechanism. Give yourself a little bit of time to acknowledge that. Then, you'd like to participate in some kind of ritualistic behavior. Some of these might include exercise. I've discovered that a lot of people who have lost their will to think too far ahead, but they're okay in terms of doing the here and now activities such as taking a walk in the park, doing several sets of 20 or 30 push-ups at a go, seem to derive some kind of benefit because while the body is getting stronger, it functions as a metaphor for the individual to become stronger. Next, photography. What I find interesting about photography is that when you start looking through that lens, your entire worldview seems to shift. And at the same time, your mental representations begin to start targeting things of beauty and of aesthetics. As a result, you start noticing differences between the fluttering of a butterfly's wings and the fluttering of a bird's wings, the nature of a sunset at 6 p.m. versus a sunrise at 6 a.m. And by comparing these things, what you're really tapping into is the idea of mindful distinction. Professor Ellen Langer of Harvard University, in her research in mindfulness of many decades, has highlighted that mindfulness can be potentially defined as the differences that we notice from a moment-to-moment basis, thereby appreciating growth, transition, and development. For example, if you're starting to notice that as you're growing a bonsai tree, it starts to grow in a very special way based on the photographs that you've been taking, you can take a look back at how it has progressed and feel this absolute sense of growth, which again, metaphorically, can function as a transformative symbol for anybody who's experiencing the hero's journey. Learning is also a very powerful process. Professor Carol Dweck, currently in the University of Illinois, has done this huge body of research with regard to the growth versus the fixed mindset, and everything centers around the concept of learning. If you feel that things are changeable and that you can learn and you can grow as a result of that, you are typically open to new possibilities, and this actually opens up the pathway to growth in general. However, you might find it a little pointless to learn certain types of skills, for example, carpentry or painting a house or building a car, for example. The point is that if you don't want to learn skills, that's also possible. You can always learn about experiences, thereby putting yourself into a metacognitive state, and that can also trigger a sense of learning. I'm not sure about you, but sometimes a good dose of a motivational or inspiring movie like Rocky III or Remember the Titans sometimes sparks a bit of an insight into your own soul. What that does is it gives you a vicarious experience of other people in other walks of life, but also helps you to reflect on your own experiences as they are experiencing it. This vicarious experience, looking out through your own eyes in order to experience an emotion, can actually serve as a special placeholder for your own internal reflections. Ultimately, any kind of learning, whether it's reading, watching a podcast, listening to some videos on YouTube like mine, enable you to have a space to do personal reflection. So as you're doing this form of reflection, you're also getting to realize that there are changes that are happening to you, that these changes are indeed happening and they are possible. Next, you might actually consider remission. Robert Dilts of NLP University began to discover that mission is a very critical cognitive structure within the human mind. Imagine you were going somewhere, but you didn't know exactly where you were going. Wouldn't that amplify the sense of helplessness? I mean, I've had situations where I've wanted to get to certain locations and that darn GPS just doesn't work. Think about that GPS as your internal cognitive mission. It is something that needs to be unveiled and it has to emerge through a clarity an understanding of why you were put on this planet in the first place. Reflecting about what your mission is can give you a renewed sense of life. It could literally channel all of those negative emotions you might be experiencing in a positive direction and thereby help you to contribute in such a way that makes you feel better about yourself. Seeing other people transform gives you a reason to actually do that transformation yourself. So how do you actually do this form of contribution when you're really already debilitated and weak? Well, the truth is you can contribute in small ways. A client of mine actually ended up doing a small form of contribution that made big waves. He started off by adding people to a Facebook group and he wanted to ritualize his gratitude messaging. So what he would do every single day without fail as a psychological stretch goal was to put up messages of gratitude. He will share these messages and in turn, as he's adding more people to that group, they start to get impacted by these messages. Over time, he started to accumulate so many messages of gratitude and more people began to add their own messages that it felt like he was making a difference to other people. Small things done with great love create great impact. In other words, you don't need to put in a huge ton of money in order to contribute. All it needs to be is a win-win. After all, if it's going to benefit you, it's probably going to benefit other people as well. Doing this in many different forms such as story writing, sharing of videos, sharing of motivating and inspiring quotes can actually support a community if you're willing to set the targets that ritualize your habits and thereby turn that into an everyday affair. Tedeschi and Calhoun, who were the original researchers on post-traumatic growth theory, have postulated 5 key areas. These 5 areas are appreciation of life. If you're starting to appreciate life and be grateful for life even more, over that passage of time, you're likely to have experienced post-traumatic growth. Number 2, positive relationships with other people. This means that through that period, while you might have difficult moments, sitting down with friends, discussing and sharing different facets of the meaning of life can help you to connect with them even better. And sometimes these other people may also unwittingly reveal that they are also on a similar dark journey as you are, and therefore give you some sense of hope and direction that you are not alone. Number 3, new possibilities in life. If you begin to discover that as a result of these rituals, you're observing more things that you could do, and opening up new doorways, even though they might be very tiny initially, you can find new possibilities in life. The singer-songwriter Jewel once reported in her podcasts that she was so debilitated by anxiety and trauma that she could only become mindful of her hands. And true enough, by focusing on her hands every single day, she began to realize that there was an emergence of an awareness that her hands were her instruments of doing good. By being able to appreciate that, she began to open small doorways that made a significant difference in the way she perceived the world. Personal strength. Very often, as we continue to progress in terms of these rituals, you will begin to realize that every single step contributed to a much larger journey. So take for example, when I was feeling down and out due to my dad's passing, the only thing that I knew I could do was to sleep a lot, which didn't make me feel very good, but also to work out in a very intense manner. And I still remember during that period of time, I experienced a huge amount of weight loss and body and muscle growth. That was quite a shocker to me because at one point of time, I couldn't do even 3 pull-ups to save my life. And at the peak of my strength training, I was able to do 80 pull-ups within the span of 25 minutes. Now that kind of shocked me and many other people, but the truth of the matter was that it was a consistent and deliberate effort to push the boundaries of what I felt I was capable in. Finally, spiritual change. Sometimes people begin to seek out sources of their universal meaning of life. And sometimes spiritual change is about becoming more religious. Sometimes it's about seeking the understanding and meaning of spirituality beyond the religion. And because I run a meditation community, a lot of people there are not religious in nature in particular, but they tend to embrace spiritual good practices. For example, they start investigating their limitations in life. They start taking a look at the possibilities of past lives, even though it doesn't seem to have any scientifically validated evidence. They start looking at crystal healing. They consider sound vibrations as a way to reach some kind of inner resonance. I've had situations where guided meditations bring that meditation group to tears because it's so heartfelt and so connected that people feel that sense of growth and they feel that sense of acceptance. And I think that is part and parcel of the entire journey from the dark night of the soul towards something much more wholesome. My offer still stands. Once you've recovered enough and you feel that you want to have a conversation with someone who's a professional, I do happen to be a trained counselor and I have been working in the area of therapy, especially in trauma care, for the last 15 years of my life. I'm also a member of the American Academy of Experts in Traumatic Stress. So that should give you a little bit of professional background about me to be assured that I do take care of my clients. Likewise, some of it might require long-term care. And if you find that I am a suitable therapist or counselor for your needs, then perhaps we can consider a longer-term retainer relationship so that I can support your mental health goals in a sustainable way. In the meanwhile, if you're not somebody who's suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder or any kind of trauma, what I'd like you to do is consider life coaching as an alternative to therapeutic intervention. So you can also click on that link to apply for a coaching conversation.